Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a topic that might make you question the very nature of reality. I mean, could there be anything more bizarre than a tiny rabbit causing chaos in medieval manuscripts? That's right. Tonight we're talking about the strange, sometimes disturbing, and thoroughly absurd tradition of killer rabbits showing up in medieval artwork. Picture this: you're flipping through pages of a serious medieval manuscript full of rules, laws, and theological ponderings. When Bama Rabbit, armed to the teeth, is chasing down a helpless human, it doesn't quite add up, does it? Well, you'd be right, but buckle up, because this isn't your typical historical tale. We're about to unpack how these killer rabbits became part of the medieval landscape, not just as a joke, but as a curious mix of satire, social commentary, and perhaps even existential dread. The twist here, though, these strange little creatures weren't just there for laughs. They were part of a larger cultural phenomenon, a way for people to cope with a world that felt precarious, chaotic, and a bit out of control. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight. Let me know your location and the local time. I always find it fascinating how the world sleeps at different hours. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Alright, let's start with the elephant in the room, or, well, the rabbit in the margins. If you've ever seen a Monty Python film, and if you haven't, what are you even doing? You're probably familiar with the infamous killer rabbit from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's this cute, innocent-looking bunny that turns into an absolute monster, killing knights and striking fear into even the bravest of men. It's absurd, it's hilarious, and honestly, it feels totally out of place in a historical context. But what if I told you that this absurd killer rabbit had a historical precedent? In fact, it wasn't just a random joke from the minds of the Python crew. The idea of terrifying rabbits wasn't just a quirky comedy bit. It was a phenomenon that actually existed in the form of medieval manuscripts. Yeah, you heard that right, killer rabbits in medieval art. Now, don't roll your eyes just yet. It turns out these so-called killer rabbits weren't as random as they might first appear. They were part of a larger artistic tradition known as drolleries, tiny illustrations that decorated the margins of medieval manuscripts. These weren't just your typical scrolls or books of magic spells. These were serious texts, often containing church laws, theological treatises, and legal documents that were pivotal to medieval society. But on the edges of these pages, where the text didn't quite fit, there was a world of strange, whimsical, and often disturbing illustrations. This is where the rabbits came in, yes, on the very edges of the manuscripts, just a little outside the lines of the seriousness they contained. So, what's the deal with these drolleries? Anyway, you could think of them as the medieval version of memes. They weren't supposed to be taken too seriously, and they often depicted absurd, upside-down versions of the world. For example, in one manuscript, you might find a rabbit that's standing on its hind legs, wielding a sword, and hunting down a human, completely flipping the predator-prey dynamic that was natural to their world. These weren't just funny little doodles, they were reflections of the chaos, fear, and sometimes dark humour that medieval people lived with on a daily basis. Imagine living in a world where your survival was constantly threatened by famine, disease, and the whims of the powerful. People's coping mechanisms weren't all serious and pious. They had a sense of humour too, and sometimes that humour took the form of a rabbit wielding a weapon that could put the toughest knight to shame. Historians still argue whether these drolleries had any specific symbolic meaning. Were they just meant to be a laugh? Or were they subtle social commentaries on the randomness of life? Could these strange drawings be a way for people to process their everyday fears and anxieties? The truth is, we might never fully know, but one thing's for sure, these drawings were part of a much bigger artistic and cultural tradition that played a significant role in shaping the way medieval people saw their world. You're probably wondering, why rabbits? Why not wolves or bears or, heck, even dragons? Well, it's a good question. Rabbits, in their nature, are harmless, cute creatures. Right, they don't strike fear into your heart the way a wolf or a bear might. But that's exactly the point. Medieval people were living in a world where they had very little control over the forces of nature. The people of the time knew what it was like to have their crops destroyed by a single storm, their village raided by wolves or bears, or their food supply ravaged by a simple rodent. A rabbit might seem harmless, but in the medieval mindset, it could just as easily become the villain. Imagine a medieval peasant struggling to grow enough food to feed their family. A small rabbit could easily wipe out an entire crop of precious vegetables, putting a whole season's harvest at risk. These little creatures could have a profound impact on their livelihood, turning their world upside down. So, in the world of drolleries, these rabbits aren't just running amok for fun, they symbolize the unpredictability and danger that lurked at every corner of medieval life. Even the most harmless of creatures could become the enemy, just like the forces of nature that threaten to destroy everything at a moment's notice. As we move through tonight's story, we'll dive deeper into the history behind these killer bunnies and explore how they fit into the broader picture of medieval life. Were these illustrations merely a reflection of the absurdity of life in those times? Or did they hold deeper, more meaningful commentary, and why? Of all the creatures in the animal kingdom, did these seemingly innocent rabbits get the deadly role in these artworks? Trust me, there's more to this story than meets the eye. But before we get into all that, let's talk about the actual manuscripts themselves. After all, this is where it all began. The killer rabbit phenomenon started to make waves in one particular manuscript that's still talked about today, the Smithfield Decretals. Now, don't be fooled by the fancy name. This manuscript is a whole lot more than just an ancient legal text. Sure, it contained church laws and important theological matters, but in the margins, you guessed it, killer rabbits. In fact, the Smithfield Decretals are often cited as one of the prime examples of these strange, whimsical illustrations. The manuscript itself is a copy of Pope Gregory XI's Decretals, which were designed to update the rules of canon law. It was a serious text, meant for clerics and church officials to interpret and enforce. But when you look at the margins, you start to notice something odd. There, among the legal writings, are illustrations of rabbits standing on their hind legs, holding swords, hunting down humans, and these rabbits weren't just depicted casually, they were intense, detailed illustrations that seemed to serve some deeper purpose. Historians still argue whether these bizarre images were simply humorous distractions or if they carried deeper messages about the fragility of life and the constant threat of nature. Were these rabbits a way to mock the very serious texts they accompanied? Or were they a symbolic representation of the fears medieval people had about the forces of nature that they couldn't control? As we'll explore in the next section, this is a question that still confounds historians. But the one thing we can say for sure is that these rabbits were more than just jokes. They were a window into the medieval mindset, a glimpse at how humour and absurdity could coexist with the darkest realities of the time. Let's rewind a bit and take a look at the backdrop of these bizarre illustrations. Imagine living in the Middle Ages. Your life is ruled by unpredictability, famine, disease, and natural disasters are constant threats. If it wasn't a bad harvest that could ruin your entire year, It was a wolf or a bear that could come marauding through your village, putting everyone in danger. The people of this time were living on the edge, constantly aware of how fragile their lives were. So, how did they cope? In part, they did so by laughing at the absurdity of their world. And that's where the drolleries come in. You've probably heard the term drolleries before, but in case you haven't, let me explain. Drolleries are tiny, often absurd illustrations that appeared in the margins of medieval manuscripts. These weren't just decorative doodles, they were expressions of humour and satire, a way for people to poke fun at their often grim and challenging reality. What's even more fascinating is that these weren't just random drawings. They had a pattern, a style. It was almost as if medieval artists had developed their own secret language of humour that was hidden in plain sight. The drolleries often depicted the world turned upside down. You'd see animals doing things that no one would expect, like rabbits hunting down humans or foxes playing chess. There were no rules to this art. Anything could happen, and that unpredictability was part of the charm. The drolleries weren't just light-hearted moments, though they were often a response to the stress of medieval life, reflecting people's complex relationship with nature and the world around them. Nature, in medieval times, was as much a threat as it was a source of beauty. The idea of a rabbit, something so small and harmless, becoming the predator, while humans became the prey, is a perfect example of how these illustrations played with the concept of control. Historians still argue whether these strange depictions were a form of social commentary or simply a way to add levity to the otherwise serious manuscripts. Could these rabbits have been a satire of how powerless people felt in the face of nature? After all, in an era when a poor harvest could mean death, the idea of a rabbit wreaking havoc on a human could reflect a fear of nature's unpredictable cruelty. But these drolleries didn't just highlight the harshness of nature, they also poked fun at the idea of control. The illustrations often placed the human in the role of the prey, something that was unthinkable in medieval society. Humans, who considered themselves the pinnacle of creation, were suddenly reduced to the role of the hunted, often at the hands of seemingly innocent creatures like rabbits. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. What's especially interesting is how these drolleries became intertwined with the world of illuminated manuscripts. These manuscripts weren't just texts, they were pieces of art. The medieval world loved to embellish its books, decorating the pages with intricate designs, vibrant colours, and elaborate illustrations. The most famous example of this kind of decoration is the illuminated manuscript. The name illuminated comes from the way the pages were decorated. Shiny gold and bright colours made the texts almost glow, bringing them to life. In fact, these manuscripts were often commissioned by the wealthy, the powerful, or the church itself. They weren't just books, they were status symbols. In the Smithfield Decretals, the book that introduced the world to the killer rabbits, the religious and legal content of the manuscript was paired with elaborate illustrations. These illustrations weren't simply decorative, they had a message. Even if that message was often one of humour, the drolleries in the Smithfield Decretals were placed in the margins of the legal and theological text, far from the main content of the book. But they were impossible to miss, and they weren't the only strange illustrations. Other manuscripts from the same period were filled with bizarre scenes of animals doing things that, frankly, seem ridiculous today. These weren't just random scenes, they were a commentary on the world medieval people lived in. But let's take a step back. Why rabbits? Why not wolves, bears, or some other more traditional predator? After all, rabbits don't exactly scream threat, but that's what makes the whole thing so fascinating. Rabbits, in medieval Europe, were a paradox. On the one hand, they were a common source of food, often hunted for their meat and fur. On the other hand, they could also be a menace. Rabbits were notorious for their ability to ruin crops. In a world where food could be scarce, rabbits could destroy a year's worth of hard work in a single night. Imagine working all year to grow a crop, only for a rabbit to come along and munch it all down. That's the kind of frustration and helplessness that these illustrations might be tapping into. The killer rabbit, in many ways, was a symbol of how uncontrollable nature was. It wasn't a lion or a bear, the typical apex predator. It was a humble, fluffy creature, a reminder that the world could turn on you at any moment, and often in ways you least expect. In the context of medieval humour, turning the tables on nature made perfect sense. Imagine a world where everything is fragile, where one bad harvest, one bad storm, or one attack from a wild animal could ruin your entire life. Now imagine a world where rabbits, of all creatures, could become the aggressors. The absurdity of this scenario wasn't just meant to be funny. It was also a way for people to deal with the deep anxiety that came with living in such an unpredictable world. By putting rabbits in the role of the predator, the people who created these drolleries were expressing a kind of resigned humour, a way of laughing at the chaos of life. Of course, this wasn't just a medieval phenomenon. Other cultures, at different points in history, have used humour to deal with the uncertainties of life. But what's particularly fascinating about the medieval drolleries is the way they juxtaposed absurd humour with something much darker. The images of killer rabbits, after all, weren't the only strange things in these manuscripts. There were also depictions of people being hunted by animals, of knights being attacked by all sorts of bizarre creatures, and in some cases, these creatures were clearly intended to reflect something more than just a whimsical joke. Historians still debate the significance of these images. Were they just a quirky artistic tradition? Or did they have deeper cultural meanings? In the case of the killer rabbits, one possible explanation is that they were a way to represent the fragility of human life. It's easy to look at these drawings and laugh, but there's a darker subtext at play. The medieval world was a place where survival was never guaranteed. People were constantly on edge, always one bad harvest or one plague away from disaster. So, perhaps these drolleries were a way to confront that anxiety. Instead of taking the world too seriously, people chose to laugh at it. And what better way to do that than with a tiny rabbit wielding a sword and chasing down a knight? But that doesn't mean these drolleries were purely negative or bleak in many ways. They represented a form of resilience. The rabbits in these manuscripts weren't just symbols of danger. They were also symbols of survival, of making do with the unpredictable. They were part of a larger tradition in medieval art where absurdity and humour were used as coping mechanisms in the face of a world that seemed random and chaotic. These little drawings provided a form of escapism, a way to laugh at the things that seemed too big to control. As we move through the story, we'll explore how these little rabbits fit into the larger context of medieval art and culture. Were they just part of a joke, or was there more to their role in these illuminated manuscripts? And what do these rabbits tell us about the people who created them? Stick with me, because we're about to dive deeper into the strange, wonderful, and sometimes absurd world of medieval drolleries and the killer rabbits that ruled the margins. So, here's the deal. You've seen the killer rabbits, heard about the wild world of drolleries, and even laughed at the absurdity of it all. But now, let's get to the heart of the mystery. Why on earth would anyone add a killer rabbit to a manuscript that was supposed to be about serious topics, church law, the sanctity of religious authority, and the edicts of popes, you might be thinking? A rabbit's not exactly the type of creature I'd associate with enforcing canon law. And you'd be right, but stick with me, because there's more to this than just medieval artists having a laugh. Let's dive into the Smithfield Decretals, the manuscript that's often cited as the prime source for these infamous killer rabbits on the surface. This manuscript was no joke. It was a legal document filled with decrees and rules from Pope Gregory XI, written in the 14th century. This was the kind of text that set the rules for how the church operated, a seriously important book that had a hand in shaping the medieval world. And yet, tucked away in the margins of this weighty, law-heavy manuscript, were these ridiculous scenes of killer rabbits causing havoc. You've got rabbits with swords, rabbits chasing down humans, and rabbits even wielding maces and axes. It's like the world of high-stakes religious authority was being upstaged by a tiny bunny brigade. Historians still aren't entirely sure why this happened. Could it be that these absurd, murderous rabbits were a way for medieval artists to subvert the seriousness of the text? Were they poking fun at the very idea of authority and power? After all, the church was an institution that held immense power during the medieval period, and its laws often governed every aspect of daily life. What better way to subtly critique that authority than by adding something as ridiculous as a rabbit with a sword? The contrast between the sober, serious nature of the manuscript's main text and the wild chaos of the illustrations is striking. It's like the medieval artists were making a subtle statement. Sure, these laws are important, but isn't life itself just a bit absurd? And let's not forget the deeper cultural context. The medieval world was a place of constant uncertainty. People lived in a time where plague, famine, and war were regular occurrences. A bad harvest could mean starvation, and a single outbreak of disease could wipe out entire communities. In such an environment, the idea of control, whether over nature, fate, or society, was fragile at best. But in the margins of these manuscripts, the people found a way to laugh at the forces that ruled their lives. Rabbits, often viewed as harmless little creatures, became symbols of the chaos and unpredictability of the world. They were small, seemingly insignificant, but capable of wreaking havoc. It's almost like medieval artists were acknowledging that, no matter how hard you try to control your world, there's always something unexpected lurking around the corner. And the more we dig into the Smithfield Decretals, the more we see how these killer rabbits fit into the broader trend of medieval drolleries. These bizarre illustrations weren't just confined to the Smithfield Decretals, they were a common feature of medieval manuscripts across Europe. The tradition of drolleries goes back centuries, and it's clear that these images of animals in absurd scenarios had a deeper meaning than just quirky side notes. In fact, these images were often used to challenge the status quo, to show how the natural order could be turned upside down. But what exactly were these artists trying to say with their rabbits? Were they laughing at the church, at society, or at life itself? Historians and scholars still debate this. Some believe that these drolleries were simply meant to lighten the mood of what could be a very dry, very serious book. Others argue that these strange images were a way to express the deep anxieties people had about the world around them. The idea of animals behaving in such bizarre ways, rabbits hunting humans, for instance, could be seen as a metaphor for the unpredictability of life itself. Who's to say that today's peaceful, innocent rabbit might not turn into a vicious predator tomorrow, in a time when survival was uncertain and life could change in an instant? These drawings may have reflected the fears people felt every day. Now, let's take a moment to think about how these drolleries might have been perceived by the average medieval reader. Imagine you're a medieval peasant, toiling away on your small plot of land, struggling to survive in a world that seems bent on throwing obstacles in your path. You've probably seen your fair share of animals causing trouble. Maybe rabbits have ravaged your crops. Or perhaps you've witnessed a wild animal terrorizing your village. You're no stranger to the ways nature can be both beautiful and terrifying. And then you open a manuscript that's supposed to be about serious religious matters, and bam, there's a rabbit holding a sword and chasing down a knight. What do you make of that? Do you laugh? Do you feel a sense of absurdity, or does it make you think about your place in the world after all? The world of medieval manuscripts wasn't just about reading, it was about experiencing the world through images and symbols. When you look at one of these illustrations, you're not just seeing a funny picture, you're seeing a reflection of the world as the artist saw it. A world where the natural order was never guaranteed. The rabbit might have been small and seemingly harmless, but in the margins of these manuscripts, it became a powerful symbol of how unpredictable life could be. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is all well and good, but why rabbits specifically? Why not wolves or other predators? Well, that's a good question, in a way. The rabbit is the perfect metaphor for the unpredictability of nature. It's small, it's fluffy, and it's often harmless. But when things go wrong, when the crops are destroyed, when the weather turns foul, it's the little, unexpected creatures that can have the most devastating effects. In a way, these rabbits symbolize the dangers of underestimating the small and seemingly insignificant forces that shape our lives. They're a reminder that sometimes the things we think we can control, whether it's nature or society, can turn against us in an instant. And as we move deeper into this story, we'll explore how these drolleries fit into the broader picture of medieval life. Were these strange, often absurd images a way for medieval people to laugh at their circumstances? Or were they a deeper commentary on the fragility of their world? Were the rabbits simply a joke? Or did they carry a message about the forces of nature that were always just out of reach? And most importantly, why have these killer rabbits endured as such a prominent feature of medieval art? Stick with me, because we're about to dig deeper into the world of illuminated manuscripts, where every line, every illustration, and every rabbit tells a story. Let's dive deeper now into the curious intersection of absurdity and seriousness in medieval art. By now, you might be asking yourself, what did these killer rabbits represent beyond a simple medieval meme? Were they a subtle form of rebellion against the powerful institutions of the time? Like the church, were they a way to subvert the ever-present authority that ruled medieval life? Well, yes and no. While it's easy to see these drolleries as simple, light-hearted jokes, there's also a deeper layer that we must peel back. Let's take another look at the Smithfield Decretals, the manuscript that really put killer rabbits on the map. This book, remember, was no joke, It was a legal document, one that carried the weight of the church's authority. It was filled with ecclesiastical decrees, canon law, and serious instructions that governed the lives of medieval people. So, what's the deal with these bizarre rabbit illustrations popping up in the margins? Then, well, one thing that immediately jumps out is the sheer contrast between the content of the manuscript and the drolleries themselves. In the main text, we have the sober, serious world of church law. The text demands reverence, attention, and respect. It's a guidebook to how the church expects people to live, work, and act in society. It's a document that carries the weight of God's authority, intended for an audience that, for the most part, saw the church as the final arbiter of truth. But in the margins of these pages, you've got a totally different story. You've got rabbits standing on their hind legs, brandishing swords, chasing down humans, and engaging in activities that are, well, downright ridiculous. And there's something even more fascinating about this contrast. In the medieval worldview, the church was the central authority. It controlled not only spiritual matters, but also dictated the social order. Everything from your daily routine to your place in society was influenced by church law. And yet, in these seemingly inconsequential margins, you have these little illustrations undermining the very system that governed life. It's as if the medieval artists were making a playful but pointed statement. Here, you have your laws, your authority, but on the edges of it all, there's chaos absurd, uncontrollable chaos, by placing these drolleries in the margins. They were saying that even within the rigid structure of church law, there was room for the unexpected, the funny, and perhaps the human. Historians still debate whether these drolleries were meant to be a critique of the church, or just a means to liven up a monotonous text. Some argue that they were an early form of social satire, a way to poke fun at the often unquestioned authority of the church. Others believe they were a way to lighten the mood, to bring a sense of humour into an otherwise serious and rule-bound world. Whatever the reason, these illustrations were certainly a form of subversion, an acknowledgement that even the most sacred texts were not beyond a little playful ridicule. But let's take this idea of subversion a step further. The medieval church wasn't just a spiritual institution, it was also a political force. It had power, wealth, and influence that reached into almost every aspect of life. The church could dictate laws, punishments, and even the fate of kingdoms. It was a central authority that shaped medieval society in profound ways. So, when you place these drolleries absurd, whimsical, and often satirical next to the church's legal decrees, you're creating a subtle but powerful contrast. You're saying, yes, you can have your laws, your rules, your powerful institutions, but here in the margins, we have room for nonsense, room for things that are unpredictable, chaotic, and frankly, absurd. The very fact that these illustrations appeared in the margins, where they might easily be overlooked, adds another layer of irony. They were small, easily ignored by the untrained eye, yet in their quiet rebellion, they carried a powerful message. As we explore this further, you'll see that this wasn't just a medieval phenomenon. The idea of subverting authority, of using humour and absurdity to poke fun at the powers that be, is a theme that runs throughout history. In fact, many cultures have used humour as a way to deal with their own systems of control. But there's something particularly fascinating about how the medieval world combined humour with deep anxiety. Remember, these were people who lived in constant fear of the unpredictable forces of nature. Famine, disease, and war were always lurking around the corner. But instead of retreating into fear, they used humour to cope. They took what seemed like an uncontrollable world and, through their art, flipped it on its head. Rabbits, those harmless little creatures, became symbols of chaos and unpredictability. They were the ultimate symbol of how life, for all its order, could still be completely absurd. Now, let's step back and think about why the rabbit, in particular, became the star of these drolleries. Why not wolves or lions, which were much more intimidating and much more dangerous after all? These animals were the predators of the medieval world. Wolves would attack villages, and lions were the beasts of the noble class. Why pick a rabbit, which most people would associate with being harmless and cute? Well, that's where the genius of these illustrations lies. Rabbits were everywhere. In medieval society, they were a common part of the landscape, often seen in fields, gardens, and farms. They were known to be both a source of food and a pest, especially when they destroyed crops. So, in the medieval imagination, a rabbit could be both a friend and an enemy. It was a creature that lived in the margins of everyday life, small, often unnoticed, but capable of causing significant damage when things went wrong. And that's exactly the point. In a world that was often chaotic and out of control, the rabbit became a symbol of the unpredictable forces that governed life. It was the perfect vehicle for the absurdity of the drolleries. And let's not forget the religious context of these images. The church, which was the ultimate authority in the medieval world, often portrayed itself as the defender of order, stability, and divine truth. It was a force that held sway over the moral and spiritual lives of people. But in these drolleries, we see the forces of chaos represented by the rabbit sneaking into the very margins of religious texts by placing these illustrations next to serious theological content. Medieval artists were saying that even in the most sacred spaces, there was room for the chaotic, the unpredictable, and the humorous. Historians still argue whether these drolleries were simply an escape from the harsh realities of medieval life or a deeper commentary on the nature of power and control. Could these rabbits have been a way to critique the church's dominance? Or were they simply a form of escapism, a way for people to momentarily laugh at the world they had no control over? It's hard to say. What we do know is that these illustrations were more than just funny drawings. They were a subtle, sometimes biting commentary on the world around them. As we continue to explore the fascinating world of medieval drolleries, it's clear that these illustrations were more than just amusing distractions. They were a way for people to cope with a world that was often beyond their control. They used humour and absurdity to push back against the overwhelming forces that shaped their lives. And in doing so, they created a legacy that would last for centuries, one that continues to fascinate and intrigue us to this day. Now that we've seen how these killer rabbits serve as a blend of absurd humour and subtle social commentary, let's take a step back and delve deeper into why animals, particularly rabbits, became such a focal point in these strange medieval drolleries. Rabbits are, after all, far from the most intimidating animals in the medieval imagination. And yet, when we talk about medieval manuscripts filled with these strange, chaotic creatures, we're talking about animals in roles that seem wildly out of place. Rabbits as hunters, not prey. But why rabbits? Let's break it down. In the Middle Ages, rabbits were both a source of food and a significant nuisance. They were often found in fields and gardens, nibbling away at crops, causing farmers a great deal of frustration. In fact, rabbits were notorious for being destructive pests, capable of wiping out an entire harvest if left unchecked. For medieval peasants who depended on those crops for survival, rabbits were a real problem. They weren't just cute, fluffy creatures, they were invaders in the battle for food security. But the rabbit's relationship with people wasn't all bad. It also provided meat, fur, and even some symbolic meaning in certain cultures in the context of medieval life. This dual nature of the rabbit, the potential for destruction, and the value as a food source was ripe for satire. So, it makes sense that the rabbit, a small creature that could wreak havoc when it wanted to, would be chosen as the ultimate symbol of chaos in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. Now, the medieval worldview was shaped by a complex mix of religious, cultural, and environmental factors. The people of the Middle Ages were constantly at odds with nature, in a world where a plague could wipe out an entire village, and where an unexpected storm could destroy months of hard work. Nature was both a provider and a destroyer. It was an unpredictable force that could both nurture and destroy life. This uneasy relationship with nature is reflected in the rabbit's role as a drollery, a creature that seems innocent, but in reality can be just as destructive as any larger predator. But the relationship between humans and nature wasn't the only thing at play here. Medieval people lived in a world defined by hierarchy and order. The church, for instance, was the ultimate authority, and social structures were rigidly defined. Humans were at the top of the food chain, and animals, though important in their own right, were often viewed as creatures of instinct, living to serve the needs of humans, the medieval artist. Then was playing with this order when he placed rabbits in roles that defied this hierarchy. Rabbits were not just animals anymore, they were predators, and humans were their prey. It was a role reversal that not only challenged the social order, but also reflected deeper anxieties about control. Let's take a closer look at these rabbits. In the Smithfield decretals, the killer rabbits are often depicted holding weapons, chasing down knights, or even attacking them outright. One famous illustration shows a rabbit holding a sword and preparing to engage in battle. This isn't a mere illustration, it's a powerful image that reflects the medieval fascination with the reversal of roles. By placing rabbits in these roles of power and dominance, the artist was flipping the natural order on its head, suggesting that even the most helpless creatures could rise to a position of power. Historians still argue over what exactly this inversion of roles meant to medieval society. Was it a playful joke, a way to entertain the audience and bring a bit of levity to an otherwise serious book? Or was it a comment on the fragility of human control over nature? Could it be that medieval artists were suggesting that human beings were not as secure at the top of the food chain as they like to think, after all? Humans were constantly battling against the forces of nature, disease, famine, war, and yes, even rabbits. Perhaps the artist was subtly commenting on the futility of human authority in the face of a chaotic and unpredictable world. It's important to remember that the people of the Middle Ages didn't have the same relationship with nature that we do today. In the modern world, we often view nature as something we have tamed, something we can control and shape to our will. But in the medieval world, nature was an uncontrollable force. You couldn't tame the weather. You couldn't command the animals. A bad harvest or a plague could throw everything into disarray. The idea of a small rabbit becoming the aggressor, hunting down the very people who depended on it for survival, was both humorous and terrifying. It was a reminder that no matter how much power you had, whether it was the power of the church, the power of the king, or the power of the landowner, nature could still rise up and challenge you. But the rabbits weren't just terrifying creatures, they were also symbols of survival. In the medieval world, survival was never guaranteed. Everything from crops to livestock to health was precarious. And this is where the rabbit takes on a different significance. It's no longer just a cute creature, it becomes a symbol of resilience and adaptability. After all, rabbits reproduce quickly, and they are hardy creatures capable of surviving in harsh conditions. This made them a perfect symbol of the unpredictable, yet resilient nature of life in the medieval period. And let's not overlook the playful side of these drolleries. Yes, the killer rabbits were a symbol of chaos and unpredictability. But they were also a form of medieval humour. The drolleries were, in many ways, a way to cope with the anxieties of daily life. When you live in a world that feels beyond your control, sometimes the best way to deal with that is through laughter. By placing these absurd killer rabbits in the margins of an otherwise serious manuscript, medieval artists were using humour as a form of resistance. They were poking fun at the idea that the world was always predictable, that it could be understood and controlled. These illustrations were a subtle rebellion against the chaos of the world, and a reminder that, sometimes, the best way to survive is to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Historians still argue about whether these illustrations were purely for entertainment or if they carried a deeper message. But what's clear is that they served as a kind of emotional release. In a world dominated by fear of disease, fear of famine, fear of the unknown, the drolleries offered a small, absurd escape. The idea of rabbits becoming the hunters was a way to take the sting out of life's difficulties. It was a way to say, look, things are chaotic and we can't control them, but at least we can laugh. So, what did these strange illustrations tell the people of the Middle Ages? What did they reveal about their relationship with nature, authority, and the absurdity of life? Could the killer rabbits have been a way to deal with the constant sense of powerlessness that medieval people felt? Or were they simply a joke that provided a momentary escape from the harshness of reality? It's hard to say for sure, but one thing's clear: these drolleries were far more than just random images. They were a way to engage with the world in a way that was both playful and profound, a way to confront the chaos of life with humour and absurdity. As we move through the story, we'll continue to explore how these drolleries fit into the larger tapestry of medieval art and culture. Were they simply an escape, or did they carry a deeper message about the nature of power, control, and survival in a chaotic world? The answer isn't simple, but it's a journey worth taking. Stick with me, and we'll keep peeling back the layers of this medieval mystery. By now, we've explored the way killer rabbits were used in medieval manuscripts as a subversive commentary on nature, authority, and the absurdity of life. But let's delve deeper into the peculiar relationship that medieval people had with nature, and how it might explain the presence of these killer rabbits in the first place. To understand why these rabbits were drawn as predators, we must first understand how medieval society viewed the natural world specifically, how they perceived animals. In medieval times, people didn't view nature the way we do today. We often think of nature as something separate from ourselves, something to be explored, tamed, or preserved. But for medieval people, nature was both a friend and an enemy. It wasn't something that could be controlled in the same way we think of today. The forces of nature were capricious. One year could bring an abundant harvest, while the next could bring famine. People lived in constant fear that nature would turn on them raging storms, flooding rivers, disease brought by animals or insects, and crop failures. And in a society where survival was never guaranteed, nature wasn't something that could be trusted. It was both the source of life and the harbinger of death. This dual relationship with nature is important because it helps explain why animals in medieval art weren't always depicted in the way we might expect. When you think of animals in medieval art, you might imagine lions, wolves, or even horses, creatures that represented strength, nobility, or the dangers of the wild. But rabbits, they weren't the first creatures that came to mind as symbols of chaos or danger. And yet, here they were, in the margins of manuscripts, appearing as predators. The key to understanding this lies in the idea of survival. Medieval people, especially those living in rural areas, had a very different relationship with animals than we do. For them, an animal could be a source of food, but it could also be a source of destruction. Rabbits, for instance, were often seen as pests. They would ravage crops, ruining entire fields of vegetables or grains. A rabbit infestation could ruin a harvest and cause food shortages, potentially leading to hunger and even death. So, a rabbit could be as much a threat to your survival as any wild predator, albeit in a more subtle, insidious way. It's this paradox, the rabbit as both a source of food and a source of destruction, that makes it such a fitting symbol for medieval art. In the drolleries, the rabbit takes on a new role, the predator. But this inversion of roles isn't just a joke or a quirky detail. It's a reflection of the constant tension that people felt in their relationship with nature. By making rabbits the aggressors, these artists were acknowledging the precariousness of human life. Rabbits, small and seemingly harmless, had the power to bring about disaster. They could destroy crops and upset the fragile balance that people relied on for survival. So, in the drolleries, the rabbit wasn't just a cute, fluffy creature. It was a symbol of nature's unpredictable power, a reminder that even the most innocuous seeming things could have a darker side. But let's not get bogged down in the darkness just yet. While the idea of killer rabbits may seem ominous, there's also a light-hearted aspect to these illustrations. Remember, drolleries weren't just about reflecting the harsh realities of life. They were also about humour. In fact, humour was a crucial coping mechanism for medieval people. Humour allowed them to deal with the constant unpredictability of life. The same world that could turn a rabbit into a destroyer of crops could also be the world where that rabbit became the star of a joke. And so, the killer rabbit was born an absurd and chaotic character who, despite its violence, could still make people laugh. Humour was a way for people to gain some control over the uncontrollable. When you live in a world where so much is beyond your grasp, finding ways to laugh at the absurdity of it all becomes an essential survival strategy. In the margins of manuscripts, these playful, exaggerated illustrations offered people a momentary escape from the harsh realities of their lives. A knight being chased by a rabbit with a sword might not solve any of the problems they faced, but for a brief moment, it allowed them to release the pressure of living in an unpredictable world. And that's what makes the presence of these killer rabbits so important. They weren't just random jokes, they were a way to deal with the overwhelming forces of nature, authority, and life itself. They were a visual representation of the absurdity that people lived with every day. The same world that could bring famine and disease could also bring a rabbit wielding a sword by placing these bizarre illustrations in the margins of serious texts. Artists were challenging the idea that life could be controlled or understood. They were saying, life is unpredictable, chaotic, and absurd, and sometimes we can only laugh at it. This idea of absurdity as a coping mechanism becomes even more apparent when we look at the broader context of medieval humour. Humour in the Middle Ages wasn't just about making people laugh, it was about survival. In a world where everything could go wrong at any moment, finding ways to laugh at the absurdity of life was a way to maintain some sense of control. The drolleries, with their ridiculous illustrations of rabbits hunting humans, were a reflection of this coping strategy. They were a way of taking something that could be terrifying and turning it into a source of laughter. Of course, the humour of these drolleries isn't just about making light of nature. It's also about poking fun at the structures of power that dominated medieval life. The church, the monarchy, and the nobility all held tremendous sway over the lives of ordinary people. The drolleries were a subtle form of rebellion, a way to subvert the natural order by making the rabbits the hunters. The artists were challenging the social order, reminding people that even the smallest, most insignificant creatures could disrupt the status quo. It's a playful way of saying that, no matter how much authority you have, you can't control everything. The world is unpredictable, and sometimes the most unexpected things can have the most profound impact. Historians continue to debate whether these drolleries were meant to be a critique of the social structures of the time or simply a form of entertainment. It's possible that they served both purposes. After all, medieval people lived in a society that was deeply hierarchical, with the church and the monarchy at the top for ordinary people. There wasn't much room for rebellion, except perhaps in the margins of the manuscripts they read. These little drawings of killer rabbits were a way for people to express their frustrations with the powers that be, even if it was done in a playful, indirect way. As we move forward, it's important to recognise that these drolleries weren't just random distractions. They were deeply connected to the way medieval people viewed the world. The killer rabbit wasn't just a quirky character, it was a symbol of how people saw themselves in relation to nature, authority, and the absurdity of life. In the margins of these manuscripts, people found a way to laugh at the things that frightened them, to take back some sense of control over the chaotic world they lived in. And who knows, maybe the next time you see a rabbit, you'll think twice before underestimating its power. After all, in medieval times, those fluffy creatures weren't so harmless after all. They might have been lurking in the margins, ready to take you down with a sword. Now that we've explored the quirky, subversive humour behind the killer rabbits, let's take a moment to pause and consider what this all tells us about the broader medieval mindset. It's easy to look at these drolleries and think of them as just funny. Absurd little jokes, something that medieval artists threw in to break up the monotony of law books or religious texts. But if we dig a little deeper, we start to see that these whimsical images were not only a form of entertainment, they were also a reflection of the anxieties and fears that shaped medieval life. The killer rabbit, in all its absurdity, is a symbol of the medieval psyche, a psyche that was constantly grappling with the unpredictability of nature, authority, and even death itself. When we look at medieval manuscripts, we're not just seeing pictures and words, we're seeing a mirror of the world in which these manuscripts were created. The people who lived during the Middle Ages had a very different view of the world than we do today. They didn't have the same scientific understanding of the natural world, nor did they have the same sense of control over their environment. Instead, they lived in a world that seemed constantly on the verge of chaos. Disease, famine, and war were ever-present threats, and the social order was rigid and often oppressive in such a world. The idea of control was both a comforting and elusive notion. Power was concentrated in the hands of a few, the church, the monarchy, and the nobility, and for most people, their lives were dictated by forces beyond their control. This is where the killer rabbits come in, by making these small, seemingly insignificant creatures the predators. Medieval artists were flipping the script on the natural order. The role of predator and prey was supposed to be clear. Humans were at the top of the food chain, and animals were there to serve them. But in these drolleries, rabbits of all creatures were the ones doing the hunting. This inversion of roles wasn't just a random bit of humour. It was a reflection of how the people of the Middle Ages viewed their own power, or lack thereof. Just like the rabbit, they were at the mercy of larger forces, whether it was the church, the weather, or the whims of the ruling class. In a world where everything could change in an instant, where a single plague or bad harvest could ruin everything, there was a constant feeling of being at the mercy of forces you couldn't control. This is why the idea of a rabbit wielding a sword and hunting humans is so powerful. It's not just funny because it's absurd, it's funny because it resonates with the fears of people who lived in a world where even the most innocent-looking things could suddenly become a threat. A rabbit, once considered harmless, becomes a symbol of nature's unpredictability, just like the people of the Middle Ages. The rabbit's power came from its ability to catch you off guard. But this isn't the only way that these drolleries reflect the medieval mindset. There's also the fact that the rabbits and other animals were often depicted in situations that reflected the unpredictable nature of life itself. For example, in some of the illustrations, animals are shown acting out human behaviours, like playing chess or engaging in combat. This inversion of roles where animals take on human traits was another way for medieval artists to comment on the unpredictability of life. If animals could act like humans, then humans were no longer in control of their own destinies. They were subject to the whims of fate, just as animals were. These drolleries served as a visual reminder that, despite our attempts to control the world, life was still a chaotic, unpredictable experience. Now, let's look at how these absurd drolleries were a form of satire. The medieval world was one of deep religious and political hierarchy. The church held immense power, dictating not only spiritual matters, but also much of the political and social structure. Similarly, the monarchy and nobility were at the top of the social pyramid, with peasants and common folk at the bottom. The authority of these institutions was nearly absolute, and yet, in the margins of religious texts and legal manuscripts, we see these bizarre, playful illustrations that mock the very order these institutions tried to impose. The rabbits, in their ridiculousness, challenged the natural order by portraying them as hunters and humans as prey. The artists were poking fun at the idea that the world had to be rigidly controlled. It's worth noting that the drolleries weren't just about mocking authority, they were also about recognizing the absurdity of life itself. In a world where power could be seized or lost in an instant, where the next day could bring the plague or an invading army, the best way to deal with that uncertainty might just be to laugh. These drolleries were, in some sense, a way to confront the chaos of the world without succumbing to it. If you can laugh at a rabbit wielding a sword, perhaps you can face the rest of life's absurdities with a bit more grace, humour. In this context, became a survival strategy, a way to cope with the unpredictability and danger that constantly threatened medieval life. But how did these drolleries come to symbolize the fragility of power and control? The answer lies in the nature of medieval art itself. Art during the Middle Ages wasn't just about creating beautiful pictures, it was about creating meaning. Art was used to convey messages, to communicate ideas about faith, morality, and the social order, and within that context, the drolleries represented a subtle challenge to the dominant institutions of the time. By placing these absurd images next to serious religious or legal texts, the artists were sending a message. No matter how much power the church, the monarchy, or the nobility held, there was always room for chaos and humour at the margins. Even in the most structured, ordered parts of life, there was still space for the unpredictable, the ridiculous, and the downright absurd. In a way, these killer rabbits and the drolleries in general were the medieval version of the modern meme. They were small, humorous moments that allowed people to express dissatisfaction with the world around them in a way that was both playful and pointed. The killer rabbit was a way to laugh at the absurdity of the world without taking it too seriously. It was a way to acknowledge the chaos and unpredictability of life while still finding some sense of humour in it. But what about the people who created these drolleries? What do they reveal about the medieval artists who placed these ridiculous, killer rabbits in the margins of their manuscripts? To understand this, we need to look at the role of the artist in medieval society. Unlike today, when artists are often seen as independent creators, medieval artists were often commissioned by wealthy patrons, whether the church, the monarchy, or the nobility. They were working within a system that demanded conformity to religious and political ideals. But within that system, they found a way to express their own humour and frustration. The drolleries were their way of taking control of a chaotic world, a world they had little power over, and making it their own. So, as we wrap up our exploration of killer rabbits, it's clear that they represent much more than just funny illustrations in the margins of medieval manuscripts. They are symbols of the medieval worldview, symbols of the unpredictable, chaotic nature of life, and a way for people to cope with the overwhelming forces that ruled their lives. Through these absurd, playful images, the artists were making a subtle statement about the fragility of control, the absurdity of power, and the constant struggle to find humour in a world that was often too chaotic to understand. And perhaps, in the end, that's what these killer rabbits were really about, finding a way to laugh at the things that frightened you, to find humour in the chaos, and to survive. Despite it all, now that we've explored how the absurdity of killer rabbits connects to the broader themes of medieval life, let's take a closer look at how these bizarre drolleries fit into the larger tradition of medieval art. It's easy to dismiss these illustrations as mere distractions, funny little sketches tucked away in the margins of serious texts. But when we examine the role of illuminated manuscripts in the medieval world, it becomes clear that these drolleries were much more than random scribbles. They were part of a larger cultural phenomenon that reflected the complexities of medieval life. The tradition of illuminated manuscripts dates back to the early Middle Ages, and these manuscripts were far more than just books, they were works of art. The term illuminated comes from the way the pages of these manuscripts were decorated with gold leaf, vibrant colours, and intricate designs. Each manuscript was painstakingly created by hand, often by monks or scribes in monastic scriptoria. These manuscripts were often incredibly expensive to produce, and as a result, they were typically commissioned by wealthy patrons or institutions, such as the church or the monarchy. The role of these manuscripts was not just to transmit information, they were also objects of devotion and status for the church. Illuminated manuscripts were tools for teaching and spreading religious doctrine. For the nobility, they were symbols of wealth and power, but no matter the purpose. The common thread in all of these manuscripts was that they were designed to be visually stunning. The text itself might be serious, full of religious instruction, legal decrees, or historical records, but the art surrounding that text often had a different purpose: to engage the viewer's imagination, to communicate in ways that words alone could not. This is where the drolleries come in. These little illustrations were not simply decorative, they were part of the manuscript's visual language. The margins of these manuscripts were often filled with intricate images of animals, plants, and people. Some of these images were quite serious, depicting religious themes, moral lessons, or allegorical figures, but others were whimsical, strange, and downright absurd. And among the most absurd of these images were the killer rabbits. At first glance, it may seem like these drolleries were simply random moments of humour, but in reality, they were carefully crafted parts of the visual storytelling that was common in medieval art. These images weren't just there for comic relief, they were a way to communicate deeper ideas about the world. They were a way to express the unpredictability of life, to poke fun at the rigid social structures, and to reflect the chaotic nature of existence. And in many ways, they were a way to cope with the uncertainties of the medieval world. But let's think about the significance of the marginalia, the illustrations in the margins of the manuscripts. The margins were, in a sense, the fringe of the manuscript, the main text, which often dealt with serious topics like religion, law, or history, was the focal point. But the margins, where the drolleries lived, were the space for play, for subversion, and for the things that couldn't fit neatly into the main narrative. It's in these margins that we find the killer rabbits, the foxes playing chess, and the other absurd creatures that turn the world upside down. In a sense, the margins were a place where medieval artists could express their frustrations, their humour, and their anxieties about the world in ways that the main text could not. While the text may have adhered to the rules and order imposed by the church or the monarchy, the margins were free from those constraints. It was in the margins that medieval artists could introduce a sense of chaos, of unpredictability, and of humour. The killer rabbit, in this context, becomes a symbol of the subversive power of humour and play. It was a way to express the absurdity of the world without challenging the authority of the text itself. Now, it's important to note that these drolleries were not just some whimsical afterthoughts. They were part of a well-established tradition in medieval art. In fact, the term drolleries itself comes from the French word drollerie, which means a joke or a jest. These illustrations were, in many ways, a medieval form of satire. They poked fun at the established social order, at the seriousness of the religious and legal texts they accompanied, and at the unpredictable nature of life, by placing these absurd images next to serious texts. Artists were making a subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, commentary on the world they lived in. But these drolleries were also a reflection of the medieval worldview itself. The Middle Ages were a time of great uncertainty and fear. People lived in a world where famine, disease, and war were constant threats. The natural world, which they had little control over, could be as much a source of terror as it was a provider of sustenance. And so, the killer rabbit, a small, seemingly insignificant creature, became a symbol of that unpredictability. It was a reminder that even the smallest and most harmless-seeming things could bring about destruction. The rabbit, in this context, was both a joke and a warning. Let's also consider the role of the artist in this context. The medieval artist was not just a craftsman, they were also a storyteller. Their job was to visually communicate ideas, emotions, and themes that were often complex and difficult to express in words alone. And in the case of the drolleries, the artist was using humour and absurdity as a way to communicate deeper truths about the world. The killer rabbit wasn't just a joke, it was a way to express the unpredictable nature of life and the anxieties that came with it. It was a way to confront the chaos of the world without being overwhelmed by it. And the fact that these drolleries survived for so many centuries speaks to their power and resonance. These illustrations weren't just random distractions, they were part of a larger cultural conversation about life, death, power, and control. They were a way for medieval people to cope with the unpredictability of their world and to express their frustrations in ways that were both playful and profound. As we continue to explore the world of medieval illuminated manuscripts, we'll see how these drolleries fit into a larger tradition of medieval art and how they helped shape the way people viewed the world around them. Were they just a way to pass the time, or did they carry a deeper message about the fragility of power and the absurdity of life? As we dig deeper into the world of these killer rabbits and their absurd counterparts, we'll uncover more about the medieval mindset and perhaps even discover something about our own. Now that we've spent a good deal of time unraveling the significance of the killer rabbits in medieval art, it's time to step back and think more broadly about how these drolleries and the idea of animals behaving in such absurd ways fit into the larger cultural landscape of the Middle Ages. Why did these peculiar and often ridiculous creatures show up in illuminated manuscripts at all? What does it say about how medieval people viewed the world and their place within it? Let's start with something fundamental in the Middle Ages. Life was not easy. The world was unpredictable, chaotic, and often harsh. A bad harvest could mean famine. A sudden illness could mean death. And natural disasters like floods and storms could wipe out entire villages. Medieval people lived in a state of constant uncertainty, where the world around them was something to be feared rather than controlled. This is why many historians argue that the medieval worldview was one of cosmic disorder, a world where the natural order seemed to be constantly in flux, and the forces of nature, fate, and the divine were all at play. In such a world, Humour, especially the kind of humour found in drolleries, was not just a way to pass the time. It was a means of survival. In fact, it was a coping mechanism. When everything around you was uncertain, and when every day felt like a fight for survival, the ability to laugh at the absurdity of it all was vital. These drolleries with their absurd, often chaotic depictions of animals served as a reminder that life didn't have to make sense. It didn't have to be controlled. Sometimes, in the face of overwhelming forces, the best thing you could do was laugh. But this humour was not simply frivolous. It was deeply tied to the medieval experience. The killer rabbits and other bizarre creatures were not just there to amuse the viewer. They were a way of confronting the harshness of life in the medieval world. These drawings were reflections of the anxiety people felt about the unpredictability of nature and the fragility of human control. By depicting animals, particularly rabbits, as the aggressors in these drolleries, the artists were making a subtle but pointed statement. Even the smallest and seemingly weakest creatures could have the power to disrupt the natural order. A rabbit, once seen as an innocent creature, could wreak havoc on an entire harvest just as a single storm could destroy a village. This was a reflection of how medieval people viewed their relationship with the natural world: unpredictable, uncontrollable, and often terrifying. But what makes the use of rabbits in these drolleries particularly fascinating is the fact that rabbits were, in many ways, the perfect symbol for this kind of chaos. They were small, seemingly innocent creatures that could easily be overlooked, but that's exactly the point. In a world where everything seemed to be on the edge of collapse, even the smallest, most innocent things could become threats. The rabbit, in this sense, was a perfect stand-in for the randomness of life itself. It wasn't a lion or a wolf, both of which would have been obvious symbols of danger and strength. It was something seemingly harmless, a rabbit that was capable of causing significant disruption. But let's not get bogged down in the darkness just yet. The killer rabbit was not just a symbol of destruction. It was also a reflection of the medieval love of playfulness and irreverence. Medieval people didn't live their lives entirely in fear and anxiety. Despite the challenges they faced, they still found ways to laugh, to make light of the chaos around them, and to subvert the rigid systems of authority that govern their lives. And this is where the drolleries with their killer rabbits, foxes playing chess, and other absurdities come into play. These images were a form of social commentary. Yes, but they were also a way to inject humour into an otherwise dark and oppressive world. It's important to note that the drolleries were not just a form of escape from the harshness of medieval life. They were also a way of questioning the authority that controlled that life. The medieval church and the monarchy were powerful institutions, with the church in particular wielding immense influence over both spiritual and political matters. In many ways, the drolleries represented a subtle challenge to that authority by placing absurd, chaotic images in the margins of otherwise serious texts. The artists were suggesting that even the most sacred and revered institutions were not above ridicule. The killer rabbit wasn't just a random bit of humour, it was a pointed critique of the power structures that held medieval society in place. By flipping the natural order, by making rabbits the predators and humans the prey, the artists were making a statement about the fragility of the social order. Humans, once thought to be the rulers of nature, were no longer at the top of the food chain. They were vulnerable to the whims of nature, fate, and yes, even the humble rabbit. This inversion of roles where the hunter became the hunted was a way for the artist to challenge the idea of a stable, predictable world. It was a way to say, yes, we have laws, we have the church, we have the monarchy, but in the end, the world is just as chaotic and unpredictable as a rabbit with a sword. And let's not forget the broader cultural significance of these drolleries. They were a part of a tradition that spanned centuries. The idea of animals behaving in absurd ways was not unique to medieval manuscripts. It had its roots in ancient cultures, where animals were often depicted as symbolic representations of human traits. In many ancient cultures, animals were seen as metaphors for the forces of nature, the qualities of human behaviour, and the ever-present balance between order and chaos. In this sense, the medieval drolleries were a continuation of that tradition. They used animals' rabbits, in this case as stand-ins for the unpredictable and uncontrollable aspects of life, but they also used them as a way to make a joke, to subvert the seriousness of the world, and to remind people that sometimes the best way to face the chaos of life was to laugh at it. In fact, many of the earliest examples of drolleries date back to ancient manuscripts, where similar themes of animals behaving in strange and humorous ways were explored. These images, whether they depicted rabbits, foxes, or other creatures, were not just about entertainment, they were a way for people to make sense of a world that was often beyond their control. And as the centuries passed, this tradition continued to evolve, with artists using drolleries to explore the anxieties and uncertainties of medieval life. But as much as the killer rabbit is a symbol of chaos and unpredictability, it's also a symbol of resilience. In the medieval world, survival was never guaranteed. A bad harvest, a storm, or a plague could destroy everything you had worked for. But the rabbit, in its absurd power, also represents the ability to survive against the odds. It is a creature that adapts, that survives despite the challenges. In this way, the killer rabbit becomes a symbol of resilience in the face of chaos, a reminder that, no matter how unpredictable life may be, there is always a way to survive. So, as we wrap up our exploration of the killer rabbits and their place in medieval manuscripts, it's clear that they are more than just funny little sketches. They are symbols of the chaos and unpredictability of life, reflections of the medieval worldview, and subtle critiques of the authority that governed people's lives. They are a reminder that, in the face of overwhelming uncertainty, the best thing you can do is laugh, and that sometimes, even the most harmless creatures can have the power to disrupt the world around them. We've been through quite the journey exploring the bizarre world of killer rabbits in medieval drolleries, those curious, absurd illustrations that served as both humour and a subtle critique of the medieval world. But the story of these killer rabbits doesn't end there. We've examined their role in the broader context of medieval art, their subversion of authority, and how they mirror the chaos and unpredictability of medieval life. Now, let's look at the larger cultural legacy of these drolleries. Specifically, how these strange little drawings persisted beyond the Middle Ages, leaving an indelible mark on modern society. While the medieval drolleries might seem like relics of a long-gone era, their influence can still be seen today in art, literature, and even in our sense of humour. The medieval mindset that produced these illustrations, where absurdity, chaos, and humour coexisted, didn't vanish with the end of the Middle Ages. Instead, these themes evolved and reappeared in various forms over the centuries. In many ways, we can trace the origins of modern satire, absurd humour, and even some of our most beloved mythical creatures back to these medieval drolleries. The killer rabbit, with its power to both terrify and entertain, is the precursor to the modern comedic figures that embrace chaos as a form of resistance against the world's order. If we fast forward to the present day, we can see that the killer rabbit has experienced a revival in modern media, though not always in the same form as it appeared in medieval manuscripts. Perhaps the most famous modern incarnation of the killer rabbit is the one immortalized in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You remember the scene, right? A seemingly innocent white rabbit turns into a deadly force of nature, ripping through the knights of the Round Table with terrifying efficiency. The absurdity of this tiny creature wiping out seasoned warriors is both hilarious and, in its way, deeply resonant of the original medieval drolleries, just as the medieval artists used humour to cope with the chaos of their world. Monty Python used absurdity to reflect the absurdity of our own lives. But the killer rabbit's legacy doesn't stop there. Think about the way animals are depicted in today's media. We've moved from real, tangible fears of nature plagues, famine, and destruction into a more symbolic representation of those fears in modern culture. The killer rabbit, once a symbol of unpredictable destruction in medieval texts, now serves as a punchline in movies, cartoons, and stories. It's a trope that plays on the same idea: something small, seemingly harmless, becoming an unstoppable force. This idea, so firmly rooted in medieval humour, still thrives in today's media landscape. It shows how deeply ingrained the themes of chaos, absurdity, and subversion have become in our cultural psyche. Take, for example, the way we talk about the unexpected and unpredictable in everyday life. How often do we use the term killer rabbit or something similar to describe an unexpected problem that turns out to be much bigger than anticipated? In a world where we are constantly faced with the unexpected, be it political upheaval, technological disruption, or even the sheer unpredictability of nature, there's something oddly comforting about the idea of the killer rabbit. It's as if we're acknowledging that no matter how much we try to control our world, there are always going to be surprises that might come in the most unlikely of forms. The killer rabbit's legacy, therefore, isn't just about humour, it's about the deeper message it carries. It's a reminder that, no matter how much we try to control life, we are always vulnerable to the forces we can't predict or understand. The absurdity of these drolleries, the rabbits, the animals acting in ways they shouldn't, becomes a metaphor for our own lack of control in the modern world. The world of the Middle Ages may be long gone, but the themes of uncertainty, chaos, and powerlessness are as relevant today as they were then. Now, let's take a closer look at how these drolleries have influenced the way we view authority and power. The killer rabbit, as we discussed earlier, is a symbol of subversion of the small, seemingly insignificant force that has the power to disrupt the established order. The medieval drolleries were not just funny distractions. They were a form of rebellion in a society where authority was rigid, hierarchical, and often unchallenged. These absurd illustrations provided a space for humour, resistance, and even a subtle critique of the powers that be. This theme of subverting authority through humour has persisted throughout history. It's found in the satirical cartoons of the Enlightenment, the political cartoons of the 20th century, and the satirical humour we see in today's media. The killer rabbit's legacy can be traced to the ways in which humour allows people to challenge authority and question the status quo, in the same way that medieval artists used the rabbit to mock the rigidity of social and religious order. Modern satirists use humour to poke fun at the established power structures of their time. And humour, as we know, is a powerful tool for resistance. It disarms the powerful by exposing their flaws and absurdities in a way that makes it impossible to take them too seriously. The killer rabbit is a perfect example of how humour can be used to challenge the systems of control that define our lives. It doesn't need to be a big, overt act of rebellion. Sometimes, a tiny, harmless creature can do the trick. This idea of using humour to fight against authority can be seen in countless forms of modern media, whether it's a film, a TV show, or a viral internet meme. The essence of the killer rabbit is alive and well in today's world, constantly reminding us that sometimes the best way to take on the powers that be is to laugh at them. But let's take this one step further. The killer rabbit is also a reflection of the modern-day fascination with absurdity and dark humour. In the age of social media, where information is constantly flowing and chaos often feels like the only constant, absurdity has become a coping mechanism. We've seen it in everything, from internet memes to dark comedy shows, humour that embraces the absurd and uses it to make sense of an otherwise chaotic world. The killer rabbit, as a symbol of absurdity, has found its way into modern forms of expression, continuing its legacy as a way of dealing with the uncontrollable and unpredictable. So, in a way, the killer rabbit hasn't just survived the centuries it's thrived. From medieval manuscripts to Monty Python to today's viral memes, the absurdity and unpredictability of the rabbit as a symbol of chaos continues to resonate with us. It's a reminder that, no matter how much we try to control our world, there's always something small, unexpected, and possibly dangerous lurking just around the corner. In the end, the legacy of the killer rabbit speaks to something much deeper than medieval humour or artistic tradition. It's a reflection of the human condition, the recognition that life is unpredictable, chaotic, and often beyond our control. The medieval artists who drew these absurd creatures weren't just making jokes, they were confronting the same fears, anxieties, and uncertainties that we face today, and the killer rabbit, in all its absurdity, remains a timeless symbol of how we navigate that chaos with humour, resilience, and the understanding that, sometimes, the best way to deal with the unpredictability of life is to laugh at it. At this point, we've examined how the killer rabbits in medieval drolleries served as a whimsical form of rebellion, a subversion of the natural order, and a means to grapple with the absurdity of life itself. But what if I told you that, deep down, these bizarre illustrations weren't just confined to the margins of a book, they were also a reflection of the profound, philosophical questions that haunted the medieval mind. These killer rabbits, these tiny creatures wreaking havoc and laughing in the face of authority, weren't just part of a comedic tradition, they were part of a much larger cultural and intellectual conversation. Medieval thinkers, artists, and writers were not just interested in creating jokes, they were also deeply concerned with the nature of order, chaos, fate, and the unpredictability of human existence. The presence of these absurd, unpredictable images in manuscripts isn't simply a result of medieval people being amused by the sight of rabbits with swords. It's a reflection of the deep philosophical inquiry into the human condition. In a world where so much was beyond human control, where nature itself could become an enemy, these drolleries were a way of confronting the unknown with humour and insight. In order to fully appreciate the philosophical significance of these killer rabbits, we need to understand the broader intellectual context of the Middle Ages. This was a time when Christianity, in its various forms, dominated thought and life. The medieval worldview was shaped by the concept of a divine order that governed the universe. The Church provided the structure of that order, dictating everything from moral behaviour to political systems to the ultimate fate of the soul. The idea of a clear, predictable order was central to medieval thinking. But that order was constantly being challenged by the forces of nature. Death and chaos. The medieval mind was, in many ways, caught between the belief in a divine, orderly universe and the reality of living in a world where chaos could erupt at any moment. This is where the drolleries come in. These absurd illustrations, with their killer rabbits and mischievous animals, reflect the tension between order and chaos. They show us that, in a world that was governed by strict religious and social structures, there was still room for humour, unpredictability, and the subversion of norms. The rabbit, an innocent and seemingly harmless creature, becomes a symbol of chaos, reminding us that even the smallest things in life can have enormous, unpredictable consequences. By introducing these absurd creatures into the margins of manuscripts that were otherwise serious and authoritative, medieval artists were acknowledging that, no matter how hard we try to impose order on the world, chaos will always find its way in. Historians and philosophers alike still wrestle with the question of how the medieval mind dealt with this tension between order and chaos. Did they embrace it, or did they view it as something to be feared and conquered? Some argue that the drolleries were simply a reflection of the medieval obsession with the idea of a divine order, a way for people to maintain control over the uncontrollable. Others believe that the killer rabbits were a way to acknowledge the chaos of life and laugh at it, to remind themselves that the world was not as predictable as it might seem. These drolleries, in their absurdity, offer a window into the medieval mind, and they reveal how deeply people were concerned with the unpredictable forces of nature, fate, and divine will. But let's not forget that, in many ways, the killer rabbit is a symbol of the human struggle with power, whether it's the authority of the church, the monarchy, or the ruling class. Medieval society was built on rigid social structures and hierarchies. In this world, power and control were concentrated in the hands of a few. The church, for example, wielded enormous power spiritually, politically, and socially. The monarchs and nobles were the ones who held sway over land, wealth, and armies. And for the common people, the peasants and workers, life was largely dictated by the whims of those in power. The killer rabbit, in its absurdity, is a subversive figure, one that turns the idea of power on its head. The rabbit is small, weak, and seemingly insignificant, but in the world of the drolleries, the rabbit becomes the predator. It wields power not through strength, but through its ability to disrupt the natural order. It is, in a sense, the ultimate trickster, someone who upends the world around them and exposes the absurdity of the power structures that claim to hold everything together. Now, let's pause for a moment and reflect on the historical context of these drolleries. The idea of tricksters and subversive humour wasn't new in the medieval period. Throughout history, people have used humour and satire to challenge authority. Think of the ancient Roman satires, or the way court jesters were able to mock kings and queens without fear of reprisal. The use of humour to subvert power isn't just a medieval invention, it's a deeply rooted human tradition. But what makes the medieval drollery so fascinating is the way they combine humour with profound philosophical questions about life, fate, and the unpredictability of the universe. The killer rabbit, as absurd as it may seem, is a figure that challenges the rigid social structures of the medieval world. It forces us to ask, who has power? Is it the church, the monarchy, or is it the smallest, most insignificant creature in the world that can disrupt everything? The rabbit's subversion of the natural order is a subtle critique of the very systems of power that were supposed to govern medieval society. It says no matter how much control you think you have, there is always something that can upset the balance in this way. The drolleries offer a critique of power that is still relevant today. But beyond its critique of power, the killer rabbit is also a symbol of fate, another concept that was central to medieval thinking. In the medieval worldview, Fate was often seen as something that was governed by God, or by the whims of nature, or sometimes by the actions of powerful people. The idea of fate was tightly intertwined with the idea of divine will. But as we've seen in the world of the drolleries, fate was not always something that could be easily predicted or controlled. The rabbit small, seemingly harmless, could become a force of destruction, just as fate could change in an instant, upending people's lives without warning. Historians still argue whether medieval people saw fate as something to be feared or embraced. Some believe that the drolleries were a way of acknowledging the unpredictable nature of fate, of accepting that life was beyond control. Others argue that the drolleries were a way to confront fate with humour, to laugh at the absurdity of it all, and in doing so, regain some sense of power over the chaos that surrounded them. The killer rabbit, then, becomes a symbol of both the unpredictability and the resilience of life. It is a reminder that, no matter how chaotic life may seem, there is always room for humour, for play, and for a little rebellion. As we reach the final stretch of our exploration, it's clear that the legacy of the killer rabbit is more than just a relic of medieval humour. It's a powerful symbol that continues to resonate with us today, whether it's in Monty Python, modern memes, or even in our everyday language. The killer rabbit is a reminder that life is unpredictable, that power is fragile, and that, sometimes, the best way to deal with the chaos of the world is to laugh at it. So, the next time you face an unexpected challenge, remember the killer rabbit's small, absurd, and yet capable of disrupting the world around it. Now, we've examined the killer rabbits in medieval drolleries from every angle. We've explored how they reflect the chaos and unpredictability of medieval life, how they subvert authority, and how they are symbols of a deep-seated tension between control and chaos. But in the final stretch of our journey, it's time to reflect on something deeper, beyond the absurdity of killer rabbits, beyond the humour and satire. There's something profound about the way these drolleries offer insight into the human condition. They speak to our relationship with the world, with power, with unpredictability, and, above all, with ourselves. At first glance, these killer rabbits may seem like nothing more than a quirky historical oddity, a funny, seemingly random detail in a medieval manuscript. But the more we peel back the layers, the more we realise that these absurd images were much more than a joke. They were a way for medieval people to express their frustrations with life, to acknowledge their powerlessness, and to find a way to cope with the chaos that surrounded them. The killer rabbit was not just a symbol of nature's unpredictability, it was a symbol of how people, despite their best efforts, are often at the mercy of forces beyond their control. In the medieval world, life was precarious. People lived with the constant threat of famine, disease, war, and natural disasters. They didn't have the same understanding of the world that we do today. Science, technology, and medicine were all in their infancy. And yet, medieval people still tried to impose order on this chaotic world. They built social hierarchies, created laws, and established institutions like the church to provide structure and stability. But the killer rabbit reminds us that, despite all these efforts to control the world, chaos will always find a way in. The rabbit, in its absurd power, symbolises that ultimate truth that no matter how hard we try to maintain control, the world remains unpredictable. But here's the thing, there's power in that absurdity. The killer rabbit, for all its chaos, also represents the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the chaos of the medieval world, people found ways to laugh, to find humour in the absurdity, and to maintain their dignity in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. The rabbit's power to disrupt the natural order, though terrifying, is also a reminder that we, too, can disrupt the forces that seek to control us. Just as the rabbit overturns the natural predator-prey relationship, we, too, can challenge the structures that seek to control our lives. The killer rabbit, in all its madness, becomes a symbol of resistance, a way to fight back against the forces that would subjugate us. It's this resilience, this ability to find humour and defiance in the face of adversity, that has made the killer rabbit such a lasting symbol. From Monty Python to modern memes, the killer rabbit has transcended its medieval roots to become a symbol of rebellion, of taking back control in a world that often feels beyond our grasp. And in that sense, the killer rabbit has become a metaphor for the modern human experience, a reminder that no matter how chaotic the world may seem, we can always find a way to laugh, to resist, and to reclaim our power. But let's take a step back and consider the broader legacy of medieval drolleries in the context of storytelling. These drolleries, with their absurd animals and chaotic illustrations, are part of a long tradition of storytelling that uses humour and absurdity to convey deep truths about the human condition. From ancient myths to modern comedy, humour has always been a tool for exploring the complexities of life. It allows us to confront uncomfortable truths, to question authority, and to make sense of a world that often doesn't make sense. The killer rabbit, in this sense, is a perfect example of how humour can serve as both a coping mechanism and a form of resistance. It's a symbol of how we can laugh at the chaos, even as we acknowledge that we are at its mercy. In many ways, the killer rabbit is also a symbol of duality. On the one hand, it's a playful, absurd creature, one that brings a sense of joy and humour to the medieval manuscript. But on the other hand, it's a predator, a force of destruction that reminds us of the unpredictable, uncontrollable nature of life. It's this duality that makes the killer rabbit such a powerful symbol. It reflects the way that life itself is full of contradictions, how joy and sorrow, order and chaos, power and powerlessness can exist side by side. The killer rabbit is both funny and terrifying, both innocent and dangerous, both a symbol of nature's unpredictability and a reminder of humanity's resilience. Now, you might be wondering, what's the takeaway from all this after spending so much time talking about killer rabbits, chaos, and medieval drolleries? What is it that we can learn from these strange illustrations? Well, I think the most important thing to take away is the way that humour allows us to confront the chaos of life. These medieval drolleries remind us that, no matter how unpredictable life may be, we can always find ways to cope, whether through humour, creativity, or sheer defiance. The killer rabbit, absurd and chaotic as it may seem, is a symbol of how we can find power in the face of powerlessness. And perhaps, in the end, the killer rabbit is a reminder that laughter is a form of resistance. In a world where so much is beyond our control, where systems of power and authority often seem unchangeable, humour allows us to take a step back and laugh at the absurdity of it all. It's a way to regain some control over a world that often seems to be out of our hands. The killer rabbit, in all its unpredictable glory, shows us that even the most chaotic forces can be met with a sense of humour, a bit of resistance, and a recognition that, sometimes, the best way to deal with the world is to laugh at it. So, the next time you're faced with something that feels completely out of your control, remember the killer rabbit. Remember that life is unpredictable, chaotic, and full of surprises, and sometimes, the best thing you can do is laugh at it. Now, Let's take a moment to slow down, ease into the final stretch of tonight's journey, and reflect on the absurdity and humour that still defines our world today. As we look back at these killer rabbits and the drolleries they inhabit, we see how much they've taught us about the power of humour, the nature of chaos, and the resilience of the human spirit. Whether in medieval manuscripts or modern media, the legacy of the killer rabbit endures as a reminder that, no matter how unpredictable life may be, there's always a way to fight back with a smile and maybe even a little laughter.